Welcome, dear students, to this discussion on the novel The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Mary Ann Evans, commonly known as George Eliot, in her second novel, The Mill on the Floss, draws on her own experiences when writing the tale of the complicated relationships of a young woman. It was first published in 1860 in 3 volumes. It is considered as one of the best psychological fictions written by her. Many of her best known novels, including Mill on the Floss, Adam Bede, Silas Marner, Middlemarch, Daniel Deronda, they all center on the interior and private emotional lives of people in provincial communities, especially women. George Eliot or Evans used a male pen name in order to be taken seriously by the literary community of that time, which associated women's writing with light entertainment and also to avoid the difference and the prejudices of the hypocrite bourgeois society of the Victorian age. The Mill on the Floss is a Bilton Strongman, literally a novel of education, of growing up, a book that centers on a young person's transition into adulthood. Bilton Strongman was a very popular genre in the 19th century, especially in Europe. Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, Lawrence Stearns, Tristram Shandy, are all examples. With its focus on the coming of age of a young girl, Maggie Tulliver, this novel, The Mill on the Floss, recalls other classic built instruments focused on female protagonists like Jane Austen's Emma and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. In particular, Bronte's Jane closely resembles Eliot's Maggie. Both women are bookish, passionate, intelligent, have a very rich interior emotional life, and struggle with the restrictions placed on women's behavior and choices in 19th century Britain. In focusing on the unique challenges facing a woman's coming of age, Bronte and Eliot both subvert the traditional Bildungsroman narrative by reminding the readers that a woman's growth into adulthood often involves a conflict between her intellectual ambitions and her prescribed social role. So, in the novel Mill on the Floors, we see this conflict throughout. This novel is widely regarded as George Eliot's most autobiographical novel. Maggie Tulliver is often seen as an avatar for Eliot herself, who also grew up as a bookish and intelligent girl in a rural community, a farm in Warwickshire that did not support her literary ambitions. Like Maggie in The Mill on the Floors, George Eliot didn't meet the conventional beauty standards of her time. She lived an unconventional life, openly living outside of marriage with George Henry Lewis, a married journalist. Maggie's volatile relationship with Tom recalls George Eliot's relationship with her brother, Isaac, who disapproved of Eliot living with a man who is married and also outside of marriage. He and Eliot were estranged for many years as a result, just as Tom rejects Maggie after her elopement with Stephen in the novel. The novel is set in 1820s in the period following the Napoleonic Wars, a period characterized by an economic prosperity and a colonial and commercial expansion. Before going into the summary of the novel, let's see the main characters in the novel. The main characters are Maggie Tulliver, Tom Tulliver, her brother, then Philip, Stephen Guest, and Lucy. Maggie Tulliver is a very intelligent, very conflicted protagonist in the novel. When the novel begins, she is young, clever, imaginative. She adores her brother and always gets into trouble. As she grows up, she regularly feels conflicted between acting how her extended family and community would want her to be and following her own desires. The strong pull of both means she is often indecisive, and though she tries to find peace in renouncing all desire for education, music, love, literature, in the end, this only makes her feelings stronger. Even when she chooses based on her own desire, though, as when she starts to elope with Stephen, she ultimately feels the pull of her family and the community too strong and can't bear to follow through on gaining happiness at their expense. Her brother, Tom, is older by 4 years. He is athletic, proud, obsessed with justice, and usually rather unforgiving in nature. He has very little knowledge, bookish knowledge, but is very smart. He is practical, determined, and is willing to sacrifice everything to regain his family's honor. His success comes at the expense of real human companionship, and his insistence on justice and distrust of is uh, Maggie's decisions. Mr. Tulliver is Maggie and Tom's father. At the beginning of the novel, he is the proprietor of Dorlcote Mill, which has been in his family for generations. He is hot tempered, stubborn, and at the same time intelligent, though uneducated. He is very generous and loving towards Maggie and his sister, Mrs. Morse. He is proud of Maggie's intelligence, although he isn't sure what use it will be to a girl. He believes that all of his troubles are caused by lawyers, particularly Mr. Wacom, and paying back all of his debts and punishing Mr. Wacom become his two obsessions after he loses everything until the moment he dies. Mrs. Tulliver, Maggie's and Tom's mother, is a blonde, very homely woman who is very simple, and though she loves her children, she greatly favors Tom and wishes Maggie were blonder and simpler herself. She is very proud to be a Dodson and is particularly devastated by the loss of her household goods and furniture when Mr. Tulliver goes bankrupt. We'll see the story and we'll see how they went bankrupt. She shows herself to have more depth than originally expected towards the end of the novel when she leaves Tom and the mill to live with Maggie in her shame. Philip is the son of Mr. Walkham, the lawyer who put Maggie's father into trouble. Due to an accident in infancy, he is crippled, and though he is very intelligent and talented, he feels bitterness over physical inferiority, this deformity that he had. He is a student with Tom at Mr. Sterling's, and though he never comes to be good friends with Tom, he is immediately drawn towards Maggie and ends up loving her for his whole life. Though he is clever, very educated, and talented artist, he believes that his breadth of interest and talents mean that he is not particularly talented at any one thing. Another important character in the novel is Stephen Guest, very handsome and self-assured man. Though he cares for Lucy and for the life they would have together, he falls unexpectedly in love with Maggie. Drawn to her strikingly different qualities, her powerful eyes, Mrs. Jane Glegg, that is Mrs. Tulliver's older sister, is this Mrs. Glegg is Tom's and Maggie's least favorite relative when they were children. And there is this uh, Mrs. Gritty Morse. Mrs. Morse is Mr. Tulliver's sister, and Dr. Ken is a clergyman at St. Ogg's. Then there is another interesting character that is Bob Jakin. Bob is a childhood friend of Tom Tulliver from a poor family until Tom thinks Bob tried to cheat him and can't forgive him for it. Mr. Glegg is Mrs. Glegg's husband. He's a retired wool dealer and doesn't take anything very seriously. And Mrs. Sophie Pullett is Mrs. Pullett, that is Mrs. Tulliver's favorite sister. Then we have this Mrs. Susan Dean. Mrs. Dean is Mrs. Tulliver's sister and Lucy's mother. Mr. Wackham, that is Philip's father, a lawyer enemy of Mr. Tulliver, aunts and uncles of Maggie and Tom. They are all they are all minor characters that we find in between in those in the chapters coming. Then we happen to see a dog, Yap, the Tulliver's dog, that also comes in between. Let's see the summary of the novel. How the novel, how it, the rise of action, the climax, and the falling action. The novel is set in English country in the first 19th century, the first half of the 19th century. The characters move from Docklet Mill to the small town of St. Ox in the wide plain where the river Floss hurries on. Tom is sent to school, but he is not that interested to learn, while Maggie is held uncanny for her intelligence. He is not sent to school, though she wants to. Mr. Tulliver's pride and inability to adapt to the changing economic world causes him to lose his property in a lawsuit against lawyer Wackham and eventually die as a result of his fury towards Wackham. There are many incidents that leads to his death. To Tom's dismay, Maggie becomes secretly close to Wackham's sensitive, crippled son, Philip. At the age of 19, Maggie visits her cousin Lucy and becomes hopelessly attracted to Lucy's wealthy and polished suitor, Stephen Guest, and he to her. Stephen and Maggie are inadvertently left to themselves for a boat ride one day. Stephen rows them further down the river than planned and tries to convince Maggie to elope with him. Maggie parts with Stephen, arguing that they each cannot ignore the claims that Lucy and Philip have on them. Maggie returns to St. Ox several days later and is met with repudiation from the entire town and even from Tom. They thought that she actually eloped with Stephen. Philip and Lucy contact Maggie and they forgive her. The Floss floods and Maggie seizes a boat and rows to the mill to save Tom. Their boat is capsized by a floating machinery. Tom and Maggie they drown in each other's arms. 5 years later, St. Ox looks much like it did before the flood, although there are some scars that remain. Besides Maggie and Tom, everyone survived the flood. Both Stephen and Philip still visit Maggie's tomb. They are buried together. Stephen eventually marries, but Philip remains solitary. The mill was rebuilt. Tom and Maggie were buried together, and the narrator tells us that two men often visited their tomb. One man had a female companion years later. The other man always came by himself. We can assume this is Stephen with Lucy and Philip. On the tomb, the names of Tom and Maggie were written along with a line. In their death, they were not divided. Now let's see the major symbols used in the novel. The first and the foremost symbol is the river Floss. On the symbolic level, the river Floss is related most often to Maggie, and the river, with its depth and potential to flood, symbolizes her deeply running and unpredictable emotions and feelings. The river's path, which is non existent in maps, is also used to symbolize the unforeseeable path of Maggie's destiny. Secondly, Saint Og. Saint Og is the legendary patron saint of the town. He was actually a ferryman of that river Floss. And one night, a woman with a child asked to be taken across the river. but the winds were high and no other ferryman took that responsibility to ferry them across the river. Only Og felt pity for her in her need and took her. When they reached the other side, her rags turned into robes, silvery white robes, and she revealed herself to be the Blessed Virgin. The Virgin pronounced Og's boat safe to all who rode in it, and she sat always in the prow. So, this is the story behind Saint Og. Maggie has a dream during her night on the boat with Stephen, where Tom and Lucy row past them, and Tom is a saint dog while Lucy is a virgin. But towards the end of the story, no, well, we find that it is actually Maggie finally who stands for Saint Dog as she rows down the river, thinking only of Tom's safety during the flood. But towards the end, both of them are dead; they are drowned. The boat didn't save them. Then the last one is Maggie's eyes. Georgette depicts Maggie's eyes as her most striking feature. All men in her life, Philip, Bob, Jake, and even Stephen, they notice her eyes first and become entranced. Maggie's eyes are a symbol of the power of emotion she contains, the depth of feeling and hunger for love that make her a tragic character. The unique force of character seems to give her the power over others. Let's see the main themes that run throughout the novel. The first and the foremost one is the communal interest versus individual interest. This theme, which could also be called as duty versus desire, is of central importance as far as this novel is concerned, and is essentially what drives the plot forward. Maggie, with her unusual looks, her intellectual prowess, her driving curiosity, and her passionate desires, does not naturally fit into the community of Saint Dogs at all. According to that community, these are all unbecoming of a woman. Her family continually fears what will become of her. She is often misunderstood and almost never taken seriously. And she is certainly never given the praise for her cleverness that she so desires. To fulfill her individual desires, then, uh, is to break out of any role the community is willing to offer her, and so to go against it. And this conflict between the individual and the conformist society is seen throughout. Next, we see this growth, theme of growth, which is characterized by loss of innocence. From the beginning of the novel, the narrator makes it clear that there is a strong separation between living in childhood, as Maggie and Tom are doing, and looking back on it as she's doing. When Mr. Tulliver loses all his assets and his senses, it becomes clear that the divide between child and adult is not necessarily slowly created over time, but that for Maggie and Tom at least, it is created in a single episode of rendering a loss of innocence. With powerful imagery, Eliot shows Maggie and Tom going forth together into their new life of sorrow, the thorny wilderness, as the golden gates of their childhood had forever closed behind them, and they will never more see the sunshine undimmed by the remembered cares. The knowledge of their family's great hardships to come is a violent shock that separates them permanently from their childhood. Tom and Maggie are cut off from their childhood by their loss of innocence caused by their father's troubles, but that doesn't mean that the ties created in the childhood are severed. The narrator repeatedly makes it clear that the old inferior things always have a special meaning when you grow up with them. And almost all of our passages describing the mill and the surrounding area are written with this nostalgic music of our childhood. The nostalgic frame for the past makes the loss of innocence all the more emotional, for the present can never be as good as the nostalgic past, the memories of our childhood, since even the reality of the past was not as good as one remembers. The stark contrast between and freedom and independence is at one side, and renunciation and sacrifice at the other side, are at the heart of the major actions of Tommy as well as Maggie as well as Tom's lives. After his father's losses, Tom dedicates his entire life to repay his father's debts and then to get the mill back from Mr. Walker. To this end, he gives up all socializing so that he won't be tempted to spend any money he makes. And he works so hard that when he gets home every night, he's too tired to even converse with his family. He thus essentially sacrifices human interaction to regain his family's honor. On the contrary, he enjoys all the freedom that the conservative society offers a man. But this is not the case with Maggie. Maggie is devoid of that freedom, independence, freedom to choose. She is not given much choices, and she renunciates her desires and needs to conform, needs so that she can conform to the norms of the society. Her ambitions and dreams are all sacrificed. So she is sacrificing her need, even her identity is being sacrificed. The mill on the floors, especially in the first half of the novel, it's concerned about education and types of knowledge. So that is another theme that runs throughout. Much of the early chapters are devoted to laying out the differences between Tom's and Maggie's modes of knowledge. Tom's knowledge is practical. He knew all about worms, fish, and those things, and what birds were mischievous, and how padlocks opened, and which way the handles of the gates were to be lifted. This knowledge is tangible and natural, and it brings Tom in closer association to the world around him. Meanwhile, Maggie's knowledge is slightly complicated, different, and other characters refer to it as uncanny, and her imagination and love of books are often depicted as a way for her to escape the world around her or to rise above it. She resorts to spirituality. The world outside the books was not a happy one, Maggie felt, and she wanted to take a resort in spirituality. Part of the tragedy of Maggie and Tom Tolliver is that Tom received the education that Maggie should have had. Instead of Maggie blossoming, Tom is trapped. When Tom must make a living in the world, he discovers that his bookish education will win him nothing. And Mr. Dean tells Tom the world isn't made of pen, ink, and paper. And if you are to get on to the world, young man, you must know what the world is made of. Tom soon returns and takes advantage of his skills for practical knowledge, making good in the newly entrepreneurial world. And Tom's practical knowledge is always depicted as a source of superiority for Tom. From his childhood on, Tom has no patience for Maggie's intellectual curiosity. The narrowness of Tom's miseducation under Mr. Stelling seems somewhat related to the narrowness of Tom's tolerance for others and other modes of knowledge. Yet, George Eliot remains clear that Maggie's intellectualism or intellectual prowess makes her Tom's superior in this case. The responsibility of tolerance lies with those who have that wider vision. And these are a few themes that runs throughout this theme of renunciation and sacrifice, of freedom and independence, education, bookish knowledge versus practical knowledge, this education and knowledge. So, and this loss of innocence, memories of childhood, this relationship between sister and brother. So, these are all major themes that she looks into in this novel, and also the spiritual side of Maggie, that is also dealt in detail. So please go through the novel so that you will get to know Maggie and Tolliver very well, and you will be able to answer the questions. You will be able to write the essay questions on theme or simples or whatever. And also, if you're asked to write character sketches, that will, the incidents in the novel will be helpful for you. Thank you.